As we continue our series of words to live by, we come to the word honor. And whenever we look at the word honor, we have probably different things that come to mind. We think of honoring our troops who fight for us. We think of honoring our father and our mother. Hopefully think of that. We think of maybe how we need to tell our kids that they need to honor their father and mother. Especially today on Father's Day, when we're honoring fathers. When we talk about the word honor, we talk about the idea of giving not just praise to someone, if you will, but giving high esteem, giving a person a position in which we appreciate and then some, who they are and what they do. And our word to live by this morning has to do with that. Our word to live by this morning, the word honor, has to do with how we view others. In a very specific context, we're talking about in the marital relationship this morning. How do we uphold honor between a husband and a wife? How do we uphold honor in the marriage, if you will? We don't see that often. We live in a world in which spouses cheat on spouses. They treat each other ways they shouldn't be treating each other. We see where in sitcoms, one puts down the other. The father in many of the sitcoms today is made to look like an idiot and someone who's unable to do anything right. The mother is often made to look like a nag, the wife nagging the husband over and over and over again. And while we might find these things funny because they're exaggerations of maybe what does take place from time to time, it gives a bad name to husband and wife. And there's people that walk around saying, well, why would I get married and want to jump into that horrible situation? But the reality is, when we don't honor each other in marriage, that's what happens, isn't it? And so this morning, Peter has a message to those who are married. Now, maybe you're not married. Maybe you're a teen. Maybe you're a young adult. Maybe you're an older adult. And you're not married. The reality is, it still relates to you. It relates maybe in that you're preparing for marriage someday. Even if you're young and you say, I will never get married, guess what? I've said I will never do a lot of things. And God has such a sense of humor that I get to do all of them. It still relates. We have to learn how to honor the people in our lives, especially when we choose to marry someone. How do we honor that spouse? Maybe you don't get married. You still need to learn how to honor others. And you may not have a spouse, but you have close friends, and you have family, and you have other people that are close to you. And you need to learn how to honor them. So although this is specifically honor within the context of marriage, hopefully you will be able to glean understanding of what it means to honor those who you're not married to as well. 1 Peter chapter 3. Look with me in verse 1. We're going to read the whole section here, and then we'll come and go through it step by step. Likewise, wives. Now, remember the word likewise? Likewise means, and it's referring back to what just took place. What just took place was the idea of submission to authority figures. Submission to those who are over you. Submission to the governmental, human, institutional authorities. In verse 13 of chapter 2. In verse 18 of chapter 2. Submission to the masters in your life. And throughout this, we even see submission to each other and to God. In chapter 2 of 1 Peter. So just as you're in submission to these authorities over you, it then says, likewise, wives, Oh, we've already ticked some people off now, right, in the world? Because we had, look, here's who you're submitting to, and then it says, okay, wives, now it's your turn. Let's talk about submission. That's not popular in our culture, is it? Likewise, wives, we're about to make those people matter in the world. Be subject to your own husbands. So that even in some, if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives. You see, there's a purpose. Now we're going to come back to this and explain this in a few moments. When they see respectful and pure conduct, do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. For this is how the holy women who hope in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. We just read a passage that even people in church don't want to read often. Partly because it's misunderstood and has been abused in the past, not just in the recent past, even in the ancient past, but partly because the parts that aren't abused and the parts that we do understand correctly, we just have men and women who don't want to follow them. Because we often can get caught in the same thing that we blame others for doing, and that is picking and choosing what we agree with and follow that God teaches and what we don't. Now, before we get into this, we're talking about honor today, so that is where we're going to focus. If we want to look at roles in the home and all this other stuff, that's a whole other topic with a lot of other Bible verses to discuss. Okay? So don't throw a shoe at me or rotten tomatoes or anything like that. We're talking about honor this morning and how that is a word to live by. The word this morning, as I've said multiple times, is honor, and it begins with wives, honor your husband. Honor your husband. In verse 1 and 2, likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see respectful and pure conduct. How do you conduct yourselves, women? Is it respectfully? Is it in a pure manner? It says here that wives are to be subject to their husbands. Now that doesn't mean, and like I said, this has been abused because we've had people say, well, thou sayest the man of the house, so thou shalt do it. Being subject does not mean I say jump and you say how much. Or how high, I'm sorry. How much? That's usually, never mind. That's usually the wife. Honey, open your pocketbook. How much? It's not the idea of subject as in the husband dominates anything and everything. And like I said, there's a whole other discussion about roles in the home. But the idea here is, wives, are you honoring your husbands and the wishes and desires of your husbands as the leaders of your home? Are you giving them and allowing them to take the responsibility God has given them? Well, my husband's not the best person in the world. Well, I don't know about you, but it says likewise wives, which means likewise referring back to what's before that. And I don't know about you, but the human institutions I see that God says we're to be subject to are not perfect either. But we don't use the same, well, I'm not going to obey the speed limit because they don't apply that evenly across the board. And I'm not going to pay that ticket. That's not what Scripture That we don't treat Scripture like that anywhere else. Here it doesn't say, wives, be subject to your husband or honor your husband. We're going to get to the honor part in a moment. Only if you feel they deserve it. In fact, it doesn't even say only if they're a Christian. Because what does it say here? He's talking first to the wives who have non-Christian husbands. Wives, what? To your husbands. Be subject to your husbands. Why? So that if they do not obey the word, in other words, if you have a non-Christian husband, be subject to them. So that maybe you can win them over without a word spoken. And it's a play on words. I'm saying word a lot here, but it's a play on words. The idea here is, if you've spoken all you can to your husband, notice you speak first, right? It's talking about the idea that he's not been listening to the word. Well, what else can you do? Then you change how you act. You honor him, right? You be subject to him. Subject doesn't mean slave. It has the idea of love, and we see that come through in the rest of this chapter. But jump with me down to verse 5 and 6 of this passage. See, he first begins by talking to the wives of a non-Christian husband. But in verses 5 and 6, he now talks to the wives of the Christian. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn... Oh, I'm sorry, not 5 and 6. I miswrote this. It doesn't matter. Here we have the idea of both. We'll get this in a moment because it comes back up. But we have the idea not only of the non-Christian. It's easy to be subject to a Christian husband most of the time, isn't it? Because a Christian husband, ideally, they're trying to follow God. They get it wrong sometimes, but they're trying to follow God. They're trying to do the right things. It's easier to be subject to them. It's the non-Christian that we often find more of a challenge. But here it says, wives, essentially honor your husband, whether it's the non-Christian or the Christian. Peter doesn't encourage wives to adopt submissive attitudes so that their husbands can rule over them. Rather, he hopes that they will demonstrate Christ's character and serve as witnesses of Christ himself to the husband. This example could lead an unbelieving husband to listen more closely to the word that's proclaimed. In other words, you don't submit because your husband rules over you with an iron fist. You submit as Christ submitted. Ephesians talks about this as well. The idea of mutual submission. It's interesting. We think of higher, lower, lows. And we think of that in families. It's like this pyramid idea in families where we have the husband is the head of the house, and then the wife, and kind of the kids here, and then other people here. We think of it in church where the elders are here, and then the preacher here, or you flip that depending on what denomination it is, and then we have the deacons and everyone else. But in the eyes of God, there is no pyramid. There's God, and then everybody here with a different job. You know that, right? Everybody mutually submits to everybody. But you have different roles. And it's the same in the household. How do you honor your husband's wives? It's by submitting, not because they deserve it, not because they're godly men if they're not. It's to submit to them as Christ submitted to us in order to win us over. We submit to them in order to win them over to Christ. See, sometimes by submitting, by loving, by serving, by honoring, if you will, your husband, you can get a lot further. But I love the idea here that it talks about the idea that you might win them over by the conduct of your life. Every man in here, I don't want to say every, most men in here would probably agree. Please don't say amen and get yourself in trouble on Father's Day. Let me get myself in trouble. You guys stay in the clear. Wives, no husband talked to me about this before the sermon. every man in here probably would identify with this. And that is, if our wife nags us, we are less likely to do whatever it is than if our wife honors us and gently reminds us. Because I don't know about you, although in my daughter's case, it's going to be whoever her husband is, he's probably going to nag. Because she's about as stubborn as me. But when I'm nagged, I dig my heels in just to make the point that nagging isn't going to work on me. Not that Katie ever nags me. Never nags me. Please pray for my marriage after this sermon. But if I feel nagged, I'm not going to do it. Honor your husband. But don't just stop at honoring your husband. It doesn't just stop there. Whether Christian or not, honor the husband, but it doesn't stop there. Look at verse 3. Do not let your adorning be external. In verse 4, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. He's talking to the wives here. Now, this doesn't mean you can't braid your hair. It doesn't mean you can't wear jewelry. It doesn't mean any of that. What it's saying is something different. It's saying, wives, honor yourself. Isn't that what it's saying? Honor yourself. Hold yourself highly in the eyes of God and yourself. Know your worth to God. Don't make your worth about external appearances. Make your worth about what's inside of you. Because that's what God sees. Every single teen in here, every child that will eventually grow and look for a husband, needs to know you find the husband that looks inside of you and finds beauty, not outside of you. It's great if you find it in both. My wife is beautiful inside and out. I know the only reason you keep me here is because of my wife. Look, let's just be honest. But the reality is, God says honor yourself. Women, don't make it about the external, make it about the internal. Now, why doesn't he say the same thing to husbands? Look at us. We don't have that problem, do we? Look, what do they call it now? The dad bod, right? We're all okay with it. Guys tend to be less concerned about their outward appearance than women in general. I mean, guys think about dieting, and it's kind of a novel concept, and we rarely follow through. What is he saying? Wives, honor your husbands, but honor yourself. Understand yourself the way God views you. Look inside of you. Don't worry about the outward appearance. Worry about the inward. Worry about what's going on in here. You see, because if we worry about what's going on in here, it changes what we do when we interact with our husbands, doesn't it? When was the last time, women, that you looked inside and chose to honor yourself? To hold yourself in high esteem, the way God sees you? When was the last time you understood it's what's inside, not what's outside? That the outside fades. I had someone once tell me, they go, all right, this was the youth group pep talk we got on marriage. It was great. All right, guys, when you get married, before you marry her, if you're concerned about how they look, you go look at their grandma and their great-grandma. Because that's what they're going to look like. He goes, so you might as well just understand they're going to all look like that at some point, so you look what's in here. But in the reality, by the way, if you're grandma or great-grandma, please don't come and get mad. I did not say it. I did not coin the thought. Man, I shouldn't have brought my pistol. I'm just shooting myself in the foot too many times up here. Here's the reality. It's not so much the outside, it's the inside that matters. And that's what ought to matter to you. Now, there are some men that deal with this, but women more often deal with this. And guys, if you're dating someone, if you're married to someone, or you're starting to look to date someone, help that special someone understand it's what's inside of them that counts. Because if what's inside of them is beautiful and you can see that beauty, I've never met a husband who saw the beauty inside their wife that didn't think the outside was beautiful too. Wives, honor yourselves. The women in Peter's audience are urged not to depend on outward aids for beauty. Peter selects 3 ways for displaying these things, and instead, Peter talks about these different ways in which, if you will, they try to look at the outside. They braid their hair, they put on little jewelry, and they're wearing maybe provocative clothing, might be what's going on here. But he says it's not that matters. It's to begin with beauty. You see, we read this passage and we get in the fence because, this puts me under my husband's thumb, but we realize this is a free passage. It frees the wife to understand, number one, if I honor my husband rather than nag my husband, he might go further than my nagging and my words will take him. That doesn't mean we don't ever speak words like that. It's how we live. But it also frees us up not only to realize I don't have to constantly be on my unbelieving husband, if you will, to come to Christ. I need to talk about it, but I don't need to run it down his throat. Instead, I should learn to submit. What does it look like if your unbelieving husband is in a Christian and he knows Christians, because you're always talking about how Christians love everyone and they mutually submit and they encourage, but then he comes home and he gets ramrodded every single day, and it's anything but love, even though they've done it. You see, that's the idea. It's okay to speak words, but to learn to move on from those words. We also see, wives, you're free to honor yourself and look at the internal, not just the external. But then he spends just one verse here. Don't worry, there's more verses in Scripture about the husband. But he spends one verse, verse 7, talking about the husband. It says, likewise, husbands. I heard someone say this. Likewise, husbands, put up with your wives. That's not exactly what this means. But it does say, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may be hindered. Now, I've got to tell you, I've had several instances. One of them may have been here, and I know one of them was in New York, where I'll be talking about the weaker vessel, and I'll be talking about this idea, and I'll always say, look, let's be honest, not all women are the weaker vessel. I mean, you look at some of those women's weightlifting competitions, and it's like all them German women, Helga, Urku, I don't know what their names are, but it's those places where they sound like they're screaming even whenever they say, I love you. And the weaker vessel here, it's kind of up for grabs what it means. But the reality is, it's overall true, isn't it? Which I believe the only reason that God made women physically weaker was because it makes men feel important, because it's the only thing we're good at most of the time. Man, I do something, and I'm just like patting myself. I'm like, honey, did you see this? Check this out. Look at that. That is craftsman work right there, honey. And then Katie will come along and she'll do it like months later, and it'll be like 10 times better than I could ever do. But then she goes, hey Josh, I'm not tall enough. Can you get this off the top shelf, or can you open this jar for me? Yeah, I can open the jar. I'm going to break that jar open if I have to, because that's the only thing I can one up my wife in. I will take a hammer to that sucker. So don't get distracted by the weaker vessel. It's this idea. Husbands, understand who God has made your wife to be. The understanding of that. And if we're understanding of that, it says what? Live with them in an understanding way. And by doing so, you honor them. Honor them for being who God made them to be. I'll say stuff and I mean it as loving as possible, or I'm not even giving another thought to it. And then I'll get home and Katie will say, why did you say it like that? I said, what do you mean? I just kind of said it. You could have said it more nicely. I was just giving the answer. Well, it came off rough. To which I then usually say, honey, next time, why don't you just say it for me? Why? Because God has made my wife. It's not that I don't care, it's just that I know I can come across as a little abrupt. And He has made my wife as someone who is much more in tune with the feelings. But here's the thing, church. If you're a husband, understand who God has made your wife to be. And honor her in that. And that means, if you look everywhere else, let's go back to what it said in verse 1. Whenever we're talking about the idea of being subject to your husbands, do not rule over her with an iron fist. That is not what God designed. In fact, if you're not consulting your wife about decisions, you're doing it wrong. If you're not taking her feelings into account, you're doing it wrong. What God is essentially saying is, wives, fulfill your responsibility of honoring yourself and your husband. But husbands, you honor your wife as well. I love the show Everybody Loves Raymond. Who's seen it? Show of hands. Wow, more of you guys need to get alive. I love the show. But you know what's sad is when someone treats their wife like that in real person and talks about their wife like that in real person. I get it. It's a sitcom. It's a joke. But in real life, if we're always putting our spouse down, we're not honoring our wife husbands. Honor your wives. And see, I think what's hard for the women, the hardest out of these three for the women is number 2, and that's honoring themselves. I believe the hardest for the men, and this is why the only things discussed about the men here is honoring your wife. Because, guys, we like to joke, but we don't often think of how it makes our spouse look, even if we don't mean it. And we don't often think about how it makes them feel. Husbands, honor your wife. Show them the love that God intended. Show them that you honor them above everyone but God. Here we have a picture of what it means to honor, and to show honor, and to live a life of honor. It doesn't start with honoring those who we work for. It starts with honoring the one you're married to, the home. How are you doing at living a life of honor? Maybe you're not married. Are you honoring the person you're dating? You see, we have people that run around and cheat on each other. That's not honor. It's shame. It's disrespected. We have husbands and wives that don't communicate. They don't talk to each other. They just kind of cohabitate. That's not honor. That's just surviving. Honor the person that you walk this life. And by the way, if you have a family, let me tell you the number one problem you usually have, and that is you honor your children above your spouse. And that's ruining homes. And if you don't believe me, you can do all kinds of research in psychology that show it's ruining the home. Honor your spouse. Wives, honor your husbands. Husbands, honor your wife. Peter calls us to live a life of honor. To give honor, not just to God, but to give honor to the one that we take the journey with. But it doesn't end there. As we know, we are to honor all. When you take this and the previous chapter as a whole, we're called to honor all. How are we doing in that? Let us as Christians be a good demonstration of what it means to live a life for God and honor all, as God has honored us. If you need the prayers of this church this morning, or if you would like to begin a life of honor by honoring God, by dedicating your life to Him, by getting to know Him more, by taking care of the sin problem, we offer that opportunity as well. But I can't read your mind. Whatever your need is, please make today the day it is known. And make today the start of a new life. Let us know by coming forward as we stand and sing this song.